Hi, Facebook and YouTube viewers and fans and clients and friends of the Cronin Law Firm. How is everybody doing today? Welcome to another edition of the Cronin Challenge2Change. I'm so excited to be with you today. It's the second of our new series. And, it's all about empowering our viewers and our community. And, with COVID and all of the craziness that we've seen over the last several months, what better knowledge to bring you than from an epidemiologist herself? We are going right to the horse's mouth and learning about everything we need to know about COVID-19, what we can do to protect ourselves, what is real truth versus fiction, trying to dispel some of those things out there that have caused so much fear and panic in so many, but really being realistic and pragmatic about this disease and about what we need to do as a community to try to, move past this and get beyond it to a better way of living. And I'm so excited to bring to you today Kaylee Blaney. She is our Oakland County Health Division epidemiologist, and she is one of a few of those in that same category of workers. And I'm so excited to bring you her today, and she is just so knowledgeable in the field. And so please bring any and all questions during this next hour, because without knowledge, we have no power. And I don't want to give in to all the fear created by so many, so much media out there, or people not really reading all the depths of these articles, the facts, the science behind it. So here, without further ado, I'm going to bring you Kaylee Blaney. And Kaylee, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to have you. I'm honored that you're giving up an hour of your time. I know how busy it is for you these days. So Kaylee, just in a few words, can you give us some of your background and how do you become an epidemiologist?
I got my MPH from the University of Pittsburgh back a few years ago. My concentration was in epidemiology, specifically infectious disease epidemiology. So the field of epidemiology is actually very large. There's a lot of people who study chronic diseases. There's people who study things more on the anthropological side of epidemiology. And then, I specifically focus on infectious disease epidemiology. So really what that means is that I look at the way that diseases travel through populations. We evaluate how infectious is a certain disease. How is it transmitted? How do we prevent transmission of that disease? Is there prophylaxis we can give? How do we attempt to control this specific communicable disease? I know in the last few years, southeastern Michigan has kind of been put through the ringer a little bit. We had the hepatitis A outbreak, which I think a lot of the viewers are probably familiar with. It was about 2016 to 2018. We had a measles outbreak in 2019 as well. So we've unfortunately had a few eventful years, but that's really what our department focuses on, is when these sentinel health events occur. We look at what disease is occurring, and basically we try and figure out how can we stop it as quickly as possible. And with hepatitis A and measles, the answer to that is vaccines, and making sure that people who are communicable stay home, things like that. Unfortunately, with COVID, the experience has been a little bit different. We don't yet have a vaccine. I think we're all hopeful that in a few short months, I know there are a few that are promising right now. Hopefully, in January or February, we can talk about how excited we are about the vaccine that might be going to manufacturing. So it just really depends on what the specific illness is, and either what the treatment is or what the preventative methods are for that. So that's really what we look at as infectious disease epidemiologists: is what is the disease, how does it travel through a human population, and how do we stop it? So that's essentially what we do in my department.
So Kaylee, when you were going to school studying to be an epidemiologist, did you study the history of various diseases throughout the world and look at how those diseases, had been, whether, what conditions, the populations, the demographics of the spread, et cetera, et cetera? And have you ever seen in all of those studies anything like COVID-19?
So, interestingly, one of the topics that gets brought up a lot in infectious disease epidemiology is the pandemic flu in 1918. One of the courses that I'm taking right now, actually, our first unit was again on the 1918 flu. And, listening to the accounts and listening to their prevention methods and what they did and various different things was actually eerie. Because watching these videos and watching everybody talk about it and about how, it was in a few people and then it went away. And then all of a sudden, here it was in the United States, was really eerie to watch because it kind of felt a lot like what's happening to us now. And listening to the people that lived through it talk about the fear and, trying to get information, and I know it was different in 1918. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have Twitter. You had newspapers essentially, but people were still hungry for information. And for me, that was the thing that stood out as a huge similarity between the 1918 pandemic and what we're going through now is people, they want knowledge. They want to know what's happening. They want to know what they can do, and they want to know the facts. And sometimes the facts are hard to find. So, one of the things I found most interesting was watching the video and talking about mask wearing in 1918. So, it was interesting to see people were still wearing them around their chins. They were wearing them below their noses. So really what a lot of those videos showed me is we're no better at wearing masks than we were 100 years ago.
And what was the pandemic in 1918?
That was influenza. So that was Spanish influenza.
The Spanish flu, right. So, and how long did it take them back then, 100 years ago, to come up with a vaccine?
So they actually, interestingly, the microscopes that they had at the time couldn't actually detect influenza virus. It was too small. So there were a few vaccines available at that time, but the vaccine they created for the flu was actually a bacteria-derived vaccine because in a few of the patients, they also had pneumonias that were caused by bacteria. So the vaccine that they came out with in 1918 was actually a vaccine for a bacteria that not very many people actually had and was never going to actually work against the flu because we didn't have electron microscopes and we didn't have the ability to actually identify the flu virus in 1918. So there were one or two vaccines that came out in 1918, but we didn't have the technology in 1918 that we do today to be able to diagnose viruses as quickly as we would have back then. So for example, when they were dealing with 1918 flu, they kind of figured out it was a flu based on symptoms, but they were not able to identify it near as quickly as we were able to figure out that this was a coronavirus this time around. So fortunately, we've made a lot of scientific advances in 100 years to be able to identify the bug that we're looking at to try and figure out how to get a vaccine. Because again, looking at the 1918 pandemic, listening to people talk, there was no end in sight once that vaccine didn't work. And I'm really hoping that that's kind of the deviation between us and the 1918 pandemic flu is that hopefully with the technology we have today, we're able to develop a successful vaccine and we don't have to continue to really live the way, we're living right now where, we have, there are some people they're too terrified to leave their houses. They won't even leave their house. And, that's really no way to live. So I'm really hoping that, with the technology we have now, we can advance from where we were during the 1918 pandemic to hopefully use that technology to produce a vaccine that gets us back to normal life.
Well, Kaylee, I do want to get to that in the fear in a little bit. But before we talk about that, I really want to also explore this idea of a coronavirus. Years ago, coronavirus is not new. Obviously the novel coronavirus, the COVID-19 is, but if you can talk a little bit to our viewers and educate them regarding SARS and do you know why that didn't last as long as this version of it?
Yeah,
Can you speak to
absolutely.
that?
So coronaviruses have been around for a long, long, long time. Most of the common cold, when we just get a common cold back a few years ago, a lot of times that was a coronavirus. But you get it, you feel under the weather for 4 or 5 days. Frankly, you probably don't even stay home from work or school. You just don't feel great, and you move on and you're fine. That's normally what coronaviruses are. But both with SARS and with MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, both of those are coronaviruses that we saw that were just a little bit worse, than your common cold. And again, those were viruses that generally the people that got very, very ill were elderly or with compromised immune systems or who had previous lung issues. The reason that SARS and MERS didn't become like a COVID-19 pandemic strain is because those were a lot harder to transmit. So those viruses, SARS and MERS, were not as easily transmissible as COVID-19 is. So to transmit SARS or MERS, you had to be in close contact with somebody for a lot longer. And you had to, we were looking at household contacts. We were looking at people that really spent close, intimate time with people to be at risk for SARS and MERS. Whereas with COVID-19, we know that sitting next to somebody for 15 minutes is enough to expose you. That's a complete different story than what we were talking about with SARS and MERS when those came around.
But then the actual transmission of the virus, is it any worse than those SARS or the MERS?
So
Is COVID-19 worse?
So when we're talking about ways to transmit diseases, one of the, kind of in the weeds terms that we use is we call it the R naught value. And what the R naught value is that is basically a numerical number, a number that's assigned to a specific disease. And the higher that number is, the more infectious that disease is. So, for example, something like measles or chickenpox, those have R naught values above 10, which means that they're very, very, very infectious. Whereas, you have other illnesses that are harder to transmit that might have R naught values of 1, 2, or 3, which means that they're not so infectious. Right now, COVID-19, it's been kind of moving around because at the beginning it was, lower. They thought maybe it was like SARS and MERS, lower 2 or 3. And then it was being estimated at 4, 4.5, 5. So there's really not enough data out there right now. They haven't solidified saying, hey, this is the R naught value for COVID-19. This is what it's going to be. It's not going to change. Because again, I like to remind people COVID-19 is something that really has only been around for about 9 months. So we only have 9 months of data about this virus. We've only been able to study it for 9 months. So whereas something like chickenpox or measles or hepatitis A that's been around for a long time, it's very well studied. We've seen the course of illness. We've been able to do extensive serological testing on people. We have very good concrete information about the incubation periods of other diseases, when you're infectious, when you're not infectious, what is your peak infectivity. We have so much information on, the diseases that have been around for a long time. Whereas with COVID-19, if you remember, even 3 or 4 months ago, it seemed like we were adding a new symptom every week or two.
Right.
And genuinely because we're still learning. So in terms of infectivity, we're still kind of trying to figure out where on the spectrum of infectivity COVID-19 lies. But we believe it's less infectious than something like measles or chickenpox, which is definitely spread by the airborne route. But we know that it is more infectious than SARS and MERS, which are in that same family of viruses.
But I would also like to make a distinction though, Kaylee. Isn't it true that infectious doesn't mean deadly? And there's a scale, a gradation of, in one person, it may manifest differently than in another. And in my opinion, it just seems that people are so fearful. And I don't know, as we talked about, if it's driven by the media or not, knowing all the facts. So how can people really know what is the truth about the deadliness of the disease? And now we even know CDC came out and they're reclassifying the COVID deaths. So can you talk a little bit to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think part of the reason it's so tricky to actually quantify how deadly is COVID-19 is because there is such an array of illness that you can get from COVID-19. I mean, you can go from you have no symptoms at all, so you don't even know that you have COVID-19, to you can be on a ventilator. It's a very wide scope of illness. But that also makes it hard to diagnose, right? So if you're
Mm-hmm.
somebody who you don't even know you're sick, you have no symptoms, you might not even know to get tested. So we don't really know how many asymptomatic cases are out there that haven't been tested. So obviously, when you're calculating what the death rate of an illness is, right, you need to know how many people had that illness and how many people died. And it's very difficult to calculate accurate death rates for this because in the beginning, as I'm sure we all remember, you basically had to be hospitalized and incredibly ill to get a COVID-19 test because they just weren't readily available.
Mm-hmm.
So in the beginning of this pandemic, we don't really know how many cases there were truly in the beginning, because there's a lot of studies coming out right now. For example, the University of Pittsburgh is doing a lot of studies to try and figure out when they believe that the virus arrived in Pittsburgh, and it's looking like mid-February. So we know that there was low-level circulation of COVID-19 really before everything started to come to fruition, really in the beginning of March, middle of March. So it's really hard to say how deadly something like COVID-19 is when we don't necessarily have an accurate representation of everybody that has had COVID-19. So for example, we test people who are very, very sick because they're in the hospital. Testing is readily available. And those are the individuals presenting to their doctor's office for care. While you might have somebody who had a runny nose for a day that, okay, if it's still here tomorrow, I'll go get tested. And then it's gone. So then they don't go get tested. So one of the reasons that the messaging around how deadly is coronavirus is so, I mean, frankly, all over the place,
Right.
is because we really don't have an accurate denominator. And what that means is we don't really have a great idea of how many people have actually had COVID-19. And there's serology testing out there that you can go get. The serology testing is
And what is that, Kaylee, just for people
so
that don't understand it?
serology testing is basically a blood draw. So like if you've ever had to find out if you're immune to chickenpox or measles or rubella or mumps or anything like that, you go get a blood draw and they do what's called an antibody test to see if you
Mm-hmm.
have antibodies to that illness. That testing does exist for COVID-19. But again, we also don't know how accurate that testing is because we don't know how long you're going to keep antibodies for. So is it 3 months? Is it 4 months? Is it 5 months? So maybe I had COVID in March, but if I go get a serology test now, I'm negative because I'm not immune anymore. So unfortunately, because we've only been dealing with this virus for 9 months, it's very difficult to actually ascertain what the true picture is. And I think that's where a lot of, you were mentioning fear. I think that's where a lot of the fear comes in is that, we usually look to, our scientists and our data people. And, normally, my bosses can come to me, they can ask for a number. I give them a number and that tells them everything that they need to know. Whereas with COVID-19, things are changing so quickly, things are changing day by day. And, the people that usually stand up and give you definitives. So, normally Dr. Fauci can stand up there. He'll tell you everything he knows about measles. This is how we're going to fix this. And then, we go on our way and nobody really knows what public health does because we work so under the radar
Right.
that things don't normally get to this level. So I think it really is scary for people, when you have people who are very educated, very knowledgeable in their fields, and they basically get up there and they tell you, well, this is the truth today, stay tuned tomorrow. So I think that's kind of one of the things that scares people. is that usually people who stand up there and give them concrete, this is how it is, haven't necessarily been able to do that because we've only been dealing with this virus for 9 months.
Well, and also in the beginning stages, anyone going into the hospital with COVID, and let's just say they had an underlying, disease that was very progressive and, very far along, like cancer, but they were classified as a COVID death. Now I believe they're reclassifying those, and in my opinion, I think in the beginning, because people were so unsure, hospitals didn't know, and they were getting incentives relative to, the funding. We all know that they were getting more money for a COVID death versus not. Some people thought that that's why more COVID deaths were released or were, not counted, versus now they're reclassifying it. Can you speak anything, to that point, to that
Yeah.
issue?
So I think one of the things that they're trying to do is they're trying to take a good look at, for example, one of the ways I explain this to people is, I explain if you're somebody who say you have diabetes that's very hard to control, and you're outside camping and you get attacked by a bear. So you're bleeding and they can't get your blood sugar under control. That blood sugar starts to affect your pancreas, it starts to affect your liver, your organs fail, and you pass away. None of that would have happened if you didn't get attacked by the bear. So the bear was still your cause of death. So when we're talking about COVID, we need to kind of think of it in the same way. So if you're 70 years old and you're relatively healthy and you get COVID, you end up on a ventilator, you get off the ventilator, you have some long-term sequelae, and it takes you 2.5 months to pass away. It's hard to say that COVID didn't contribute to that. So
For sure.
I think a lot of what they're trying to do with looking into these COVID deaths is trying to make sure that, we aren't classifying deaths that, happened 8 months later and probably weren't related. We're really trying to make sure that those that are being classified as, COVID-19 deaths truly were COVID-19 deaths. And I can tell you that, our medical examiner has worked on several cases where, there might have been a positive COVID test, but there were other factors at play. And our medical examiner took very careful consideration to make sure that if it was called a COVID death, there was solid reasoning for that. And if it was not called a COVID death, that there was also solid reasoning for that. So I think when, you're looking at the death data, and I think, it came out about a week ago that, there was like a 94% of people had underlying health conditions. So then some people decided that meant that only 6% of these people actually passed away of COVID. What that statistic was really saying was that of the people that passed away, yes, a lot of them had underlying conditions. But unfortunately, because of the symptomology that COVID presents with, and then we're getting more and more information about how COVID actually affects the body. If you're somebody who's like a deep science person, there's an interesting article right there now about how basically COVID-19 causes a bradykinin storm, which I won't even get into, but if that's something that your viewers are interested in, they can Google bradykinin storm COVID. And it's very interesting because it talks about how COVID-19 attacks certain receptors and how it generates certain responses in people. And if you're somebody who has underlying liver issues or underlying kidney issues, a bradykinin storm can potentially cause liver failure, can potentially cause kidney failure. And even though you had that underlying condition, your condition was well managed until COVID came in and overwhelmed the system. So right. I think, the CDC data, and again, I think we talked before about how, all you need to do to make something scary is put a scary headline and play scary music, and it'll scare people. But, really what CDC was trying to come out and say is that for the most part, it's not relatively healthy people that are having these cascades that cause death. What they were trying to put out there is that a lot of the people that are passing away do have one or more what they call comorbid conditions. So diabetes, hypertension, liver issues, kidney issues, to really try and drive home the point that, one, if you're somebody who has these type of conditions, take extra precautions. If you don't really need to go to the grocery store, if you can get somebody else to go for you, go have somebody else go to the grocery store for you. If you can do click list or, all of the grocery pickups that they have now, if you can do something that, minimizes your contact with people, that's something that you might want to consider if you're somebody with these conditions. If you're a college student who lives with grandma, and you're planning on going home over the weekend, maybe skip the bar for 2 weeks before you go home so that, you're not exposing grandma when you go home.
Well, Kaylee, I'd like to talk to you about, the younger generation and, whether it's elementary school children or toddlers, all the way up, like you said, through college. There has been a varying degree of factual, information out there. I call it facts loosely. And I'd like to hear from you, someone who works in the field, who study, this, who knows more, to educate our viewers. Can children really transmit? When I say children, let's talk about the age groups here. I had read at one point from 0 to 15, the younger people can't really transmit, or are less likely, I should say, to transmit COVID-19. And therefore, even if they were exposed, they really can't carry it to their, older, grandparents or family members. And so now that the schools are still closed mostly and virtually learning is, really among us, can you talk and speak to that? Should there be a fear around that generation of youth?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I was very surprised in the beginning when information came out that they thought kids couldn't transmit it. I didn't really understand why kids were special, and they were this magic group of people that was immune to COVID. But I mean,
so you have not heard that, or?
Oh no, we heard it very early on in the beginning, and I'll be honest, I'm not really sure, where that came from, but I definitely heard that too. Oh, we don't have to worry about kids, and it's like, that's interesting. And I know there are some illnesses that are that way. So for example, going back to the hepatitis A outbreak in 2016, 2018, kids who get hepatitis A who are under 5, the vast majority of them do not show any symptoms at all. Whereas, as we know, older adults can show very, very, very severe symptoms. So there is precedent for saying that kids don't get a severe illness and don't transmit as much. But there isn't really that much evidence suggesting that with COVID-19. So that being said, one of the places that could have come from is obviously when we're talking about, close contact and how close are you with people and things like that. The strength of my cough or your cough is going to be a lot different than, say, the cough of a 2-year-old. They just don't have the same lung capacity. They're not gonna, spew virus particles as far as you or I would, because our lung capacity is so much greater and we're just bigger than a 2-year-old. So the, length of space between somebody that I could get sick is definitely different than a 2-year-old. So close contact with me is probably a little bit different than a 2-year-old. You probably need to be a little bit closer to a 2-year-old. But the reality is that anybody of any age can transmit COVID-19. The tricky thing, especially, in our school age kids, so our, preschoolers, kindergartners, all the way up through high schoolers, is for the most part, what we've seen in these children is we've seen a lot of asymptomatic infections. So kids that never displayed any symptoms, or again, it presents like a cold. A kid has a cold for 2-3 days. And then they're fine again. We've had some students who all they report is loss of taste and smell. They never have a fever. They don't have any symptoms other than loss of taste and smell. But when you're talking about 2, 3, 4-year-olds, they're not really going to be able to articulate to you that they can't taste or smell. That's not really in their repertoire. So that's why these infections in kids are so tricky, is because, you do get the intermittent kid who is really, really sick. that does happen. There are a handful of cases we've had, especially when you're talking about MISC, which is the severe heart conditions. We've had a handful of those as well. So it's not to say that kids can't become severely ill. A minority of them do, but the majority of them have symptoms that before COVID, you probably wouldn't have even thought twice about, honestly.
So then why are we thinking twice about it now? I mean, isn't the flu just as bad and transmitting that type of a cold? Let's just say a high schooler presents with those kinds of conditions and symptoms, and he goes home. And is it because he could then transmit it to his parents who are more susceptible to getting worse symptoms? Is that why it's so bad? But isn't the flu bad, and doesn't the flu have a death rate also?
Yeah, the flu does have a death rate as well, but again, at least from what we've seen from COVID-19 appears to have a higher death rate than the flu. And again, with the flu, we do have antivirals to treat the flu. We have vaccines to prevent the flu. I know with Tamiflu, I had the flu a few years ago. And I took Tamiflu and I woke up feeling fine the next morning. My fever was gone. I felt great. But we don't have that for COVID-19. So and even when people in the hospital are very ill with the flu and they take Tamiflu, it helps shorten the duration of their illness. So they don't get to that, long-term sequelae or to those issues that can cause their death, because that antiviral helps them fight off the illness a little bit better. So when we're talking about COVID-19, though flu has a death rate as well, whereas with COVID-19, there's some promising treatments that are in trials, but nothing close to how well Tamiflu can help prevent long-term sequelae for the flu. Now, it's not to say that Tamiflu works for everybody that has the flu. It absolutely does not.
Right.
But with COVID-19, we really don't. We have no, and even with Tamiflu, you can take that if you've been around somebody with the flu, and it can prevent you from getting the flu.
Kaylee, just like the flu, there are a lot of different, immunizations. Every year there's a new rendition of it, so to speak, because every year the flu has different strains, right? And so when people are saying, they're not going to go out until I know several elderly people that won't leave their home because they want that immunization first. But, I'd like to talk about that, because isn't it true that typically, an immunization should be on the market for several years to make sure it's safe? And I'm not saying that our government's not going to give us, purposefully an unsafe, flu shot similar, but and so there's that issue that that enough testing has to be done, and there's the other issue that it might not get all the different strains if there is strains of COVID-19, because we've seen so many different manifestations of it, so many different symptoms of it. It manifests differently in different people. Like you're just saying, it presents differently. So how can we be sure that an immunization will sequester it? Or is it going to be more, like you said earlier, prophylactic, where people are going to take it either to prevent, like a medicine, or after? What is your opinion about all that?
Yeah. So, with vaccines, anybody who's interested in, how vaccine trials work and, what the process for those is, I would urge you to go to the FDA website, because the FDA website actually has great information on, you can look up a vaccine, you can see what stage of the trial it's at. They publicize information at every stage, to show the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine at that stage. So the FDA website is really a wealth of information in terms of where is the vaccine being tested, what populations is the vaccine being tested on. I know one of the most promising ones right now is being tested on multiple continents, just to make sure that people with different genetic profiles are all tested with the same vaccine, to make sure that, because there is a possibility that, maybe a vaccine that works, very well in people with a certain genetic makeup For example, maybe it works really well in the African American population because of genetic commonalities in that genetic profile. Maybe it doesn't work so well in people who are, of Caucasian descent. Maybe there's just genetic differences in those profiles where it doesn't work. So, these vaccines are tested on different continents in different people with different genetic profiles, different racial profiles, different gender profiles. So these vaccines are highly tested before they ever come to market. Even some of the promising vaccines are not even from U.S. companies. They're from different companies. So, keeping up with all of them can be kind of difficult, but I would turn people to the FDA website. And then in terms of different strains, there are a few genetically distinct different, strains of COVID-19. But right now, at least based on those genetic profiles, it is believed that one vaccine will be able to cover all of them because they're not that significantly different. However, again, I'll add the caveat that information is always changing. But, in terms of, and even with the flu vaccine, there's evidence that shows even if you get a flu vaccine, for example, the year that I got the flu, I got the flu vaccine that year, but I still happened to get the flu. But, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that even if you get the vaccine and you still get the flu, you have decreased duration and decreased severity. And that's really what we're looking for is, I think a lot of us that are in this field, we're going to be dealing with COVID for a while. This is not something that's going anywhere, but we need to do things to get it to a level where it's manageable. So for example, you talked about the flu earlier. We don't shut down every flu season. We don't quarantine everybody every flu season. And there's not that level of fear with the flu, partially because there's a vaccine out there. So even if, the vaccine's only 50% effective, that's a lot better than what we have with COVID right now. And then even if you do get sick, we have, and the antiviral has its pros and cons. Some people can't take it. It makes them sick, but it's very effective in other people. So with flu, we really do have things that we can do to make it less scary, to make it less severe, so that we can continue, some semblance of normal life. And that's basically what we're looking for to get with the COVID vaccine is to get.
Hopefully it won't take 100 years like from the Spanish flu to now.
Not. But that's another thing that a lot of people ask too is, people remember back to 2009 when we had the swine flu pandemic, which I had swine flu in 2009. I had it very early, so the vaccine would have done no good for me. But one of the things people ask is, well, that vaccine was deployed so quickly. How did we get a vaccine that quickly? And the COVID-19 vaccine feels like it's taking forever. The reasoning behind that is that in 2009, when H1N1 hit, the flu vaccine was already licensed. So the formula itself was already licensed. They just had to change the strain in it. So, people are like, well, we got one so quickly for H1N1. Why can't we get one that quickly for COVID? And the reasoning is, again, I would send people to the FDA website, but because they really don't put out vaccines that they don't believe are safe. So with the flu vaccine, that was already a vaccine that was approved. They just had to change the strain. Whereas with the COVID vaccine, that's a brand new vaccine. So they had to start from square one with the FDA approval process. Whereas with H1N1 in 2009, they could work with an already approved vaccine and simply change the strain, which is a very different approval process than what the COVID-19 vaccine is going through right now.
Well, this is not obviously the first, pandemic we've seen, that maybe in our lifetime, yes, but that the world has seen, I should say. And it's certainly most likely not going to be the last. It seems as though, shouldn't we be getting better and better at somehow managing these diseases before they become at this global level? I mean, look at Ebola, for instance, and that never, fortunately, came over to our country. I don't believe it did. You would know better than I, at the level that people were so afraid of earlier. And because we know it's out there, shouldn't we be working on some sort of vaccine now or some sort of prophylactic? And we also, I'm sure in your line of work, you know about a lot of other diseases out there that we certainly don't know yet. Is it just money? Is it resources? What is the issue?
So a lot of it has to do with actually having access to the virus, knowing what it is, and knowing it, knowing if it can infect humans or not. So, for example, there's a lot of swine flus and avian flus that circulate in Asia, but they only affect birds and pigs. They don't transmit to humans. Those are illnesses obviously that we're concerned about, because if they mutate, they absolutely could affect humans. And those are things that, the CDC and the WHO and, private research institutions are constantly looking at. But again, we know that those exist already. The problem with COVID-19 is we didn't know it was coming. It was not something that was identified before. So unfortunately, there was really no way to anticipate it. And, for something like Ebola, even Ebola, if you look back at, how long Ebola has been, really plaguing Africa, it took a very, very, very long time to find a vaccine that was actually efficacious. And we have one now for one strain of Ebola. Luckily, that is the strain that has circulated the last 2 times. So the WHO was able to use that vaccine to, try and temper those outbreaks in Africa. But, even with Ebola, there's a few different strains of Ebola. And if an outbreak starts with a different strain of Ebola that we don't have a vaccine for, and again, they are working on those, but those are also diseases that we know we have the viral profile for. So we obviously know that Ebola outbreaks, I think one of the scarier things about Ebola is we still don't know where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what the reservoir is. Again, if you're somebody who's really into the science of all this stuff, David Quammen is an author who does a lot about zoonoses and how diseases are transmitted from animals to humans. He has a great book. It's called Spillover. If people are interested in things like that. He also wrote a book specifically on Ebola, talking about what they've done and the studies that they've done to try and figure out where the reservoir is. Because obviously the ideal situation would be to get rid of the wet reservoir, right? So then we don't have to worry about vaccines because we can eradicate because the reservoir is gone. But we don't know where Ebola comes from. We don't, and they've pretty much disproven, bats, gorillas, all this different stuff. So a lot of it is with these diseases, you have to figure out how are they transmitted? Are they highly contagious person to person? And you have to figure out the most logical step in which to break the chain of infection. And that's, one of the considerations that goes into COVID-19 is at this point, obviously it's here. So even though we think we figured out where it came from, none of that is going to help us. At this point, what we need to do is we need to decrease the amount of people who are susceptible, which means that a vaccine would be the next step to try and prevent this from going any further.
Well, Kaylee, I was going to ask you, do we definitively know where it came from? We hear all this speculation and propaganda. Do we really know?
So one of the some of the articles that have come out have been talking about various different animals in China that have had similar coronavirus profiles. They believe they've genetically tied this coronavirus to an animal. It's called a pangolin. I had never heard what a pangolin was before. I thought it would. I love penguins. They're my favorite animals. So I was hoping it would kind of look like a penguin. It doesn't. It basically is like an armadillo. It kind of looks like an armadillo. I didn't really think they were very cute either. But the genetic information that they had, because I know there was so much information. Oh, it came from a lab in the U.S. and then it went to Wuhan, and then they created it in Wuhan. There's no evidence that this was a genetically manufactured virus. One of the reasons that this specific research article states is because this is so genetically similar to the coronavirus that's found in pangolins that we don't actually have the technology to mutate it at that small of a level. So
Hmm.
the only way that it would have been able to mutate from the virus that's in pangolins to infect humans, it would have had to have been a natural progression, because you couldn't have made that subtle of a genetic change. That could not have been engineered. So at
So
least
like those other diseases, it went from the the animals to humans. And is that what happened here?
that's what they believe, yes.
Okay.
So again, that's
Um,
why for people who are interested, I really recommend this book Spillover by David Quammen, because it gives a lot of examples of how, a lot of illnesses that have caused problems for humans are viruses that are in animals. They mutate and they cause human infection. I mean, one of the best examples is HIV.
right.
So, it's one of those things that if you're really interested in infectious diseases and you're really interested in how a lot of these outbreaks have started, looking at the zoonotic aspect of a lot of these diseases might be very interesting.
You say a lot of big words. Zoonotic. What
So
is zoonotic?
zoonotic just means that the infection started in animals, and then, or non-human animals, and then it crossed over and was able to infect humans.
I was given a question. Isn't the animal that you were just referring to relative to the COVID-19 virus and where it started like a scaly anteater?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's,
Like I said,
and
I Googled expecting a penguin, and I got, yes, a scaly anteater is a nice way to put it.
yeah. Let's talk about, the curve in the beginning of COVID and the stay home, stay safe order that we had here in Michigan, like so many other states. It really was to help flatten the curve and also to prevent, an onslaught of people in the hospitals because they just didn't have the capacity and the equipment to handle, all the respirators, for instance. The hospitals didn't have all of that they needed. Now that the curve has flattened, let's talk a little bit about the actual numbers. So at the height of it, which was early April, what were those numbers and what are they now? Can you talk about that in terms of not only just the death rate,
Mm-hmm.
but also the infection rate? And again, infection doesn't necessarily mean a death sentence. So
Right.
can you talk a little bit about that, Kaylee?
So, for people who are interested in following that trending, most of the county websites, so whatever county you live in, a lot of them have, great dashboards that really have great visual representations of that data. So if you're an individual who lives or works in Oakland County and you're interested in Oakland County's data, if you go to our website, which is oakgov.com/health, and you'll get two buttons. There's basically a button for COVID-19, and then I'm not sure what the other one says, but it's basically like not COVID-19. If you click on the COVID-19 one and you go to our dashboard has, our epi curve for the entire outbreak. So you can kind of see what you were talking about, in early March, April, that first peak we had, and then you can really see the decline in cases. And then you can kind of start to see a little bit more of an uptick, and then we're actually starting to trend down again. So there's a great visual representation on the Oakland County website of our numbers. And then, again, another interesting thing we have up there is we do have maps as well. We have maps of where, every case has been in the entirety of the outbreak. And then we also have cases in the last 30 days to kind of show what the geographic picture is looking like now. And one of our newest additions, to help people in, deciding, do I want my kid to go virtual? Do I want to send them to school? We do have a new map that we added about 2 weeks ago. It's a map by school district. So instead of showing specific cities, we have each school district up there, and you can see the current case rate in your child's school district. So, what we've been seeing numbers wise is obviously, we're significantly down from what we were seeing in March and April. And I think even though we're seeing lower numbers now, we're seeing significantly less hospitalizations and severe illnesses. But again, a lot of that is because we're taking precautions at long-term care facilities. We've been able to get messaging out to the public that says, if you have a heart condition, if you're on chemotherapy, a lot of those individuals are taking precautions to make sure that they're not being exposed. So we really have that vulnerable population that we've been a lot better able to protect as the outbreak has gone on. So, even though we are still seeing our case rate in Oakland County is if you look at the right side of our dashboard, it'll show how many cases we've reported each day. We're anywhere really fluctuating between 60 and almost 100 a day. Sometimes we have low days, sometimes we have higher days. So we're really trending at a lot lower than we were at the height of the outbreak. And people ask me all the time, they say, well, we're seeing so many more cases, why aren't we hearing about the hospitalizations? Why aren't we hearing about the hospitals being overwhelmed? And a lot of it goes back to what we were talking about before is the majority of our infections right now are in people under 35 years old. So again, those are not the people we expect to see severe illness in. So we don't really expect them to go to the hospital. We don't expect them to be hospitalized. We don't expect them to end up on ventilators. But again, I'm sure that you'll talk to, specific families, and they had a 19-year-old that was on a ventilator. They had a 23-year-old brother that was on a ventilator. So just because it's unlikely doesn't mean it's not possible in this age group. So this, the under 35 age group really does need to continue to take precautions to try and prevent illness, because though you're unlikely to become incredibly sick, that, that little chance, it still could be you. You could be the 1 in 100 young people that has a really bad case and ends up in the hospital. So that's why those precautions are very important.
Kaylee, thank you for that very thought out, answer, and very thoughtful answer. I have quite a few questions here, if you don't mind me reading a few to you.
Sure.
Here's one of the questions. I'm worried that staying in my house 80% of the time is going to make me more susceptible, not only to COVID, but the flu and the other, like the common cold. Is it smart to stay isolated, or should I be out and about for my immunity? I mean, this is sort of a question about the herd immunity mentality. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, I think that there's a lot of different aspects, and I really like that question, because one of the things that I tell people all the time is, you don't necessarily want to be going out and exposing yourself to people, but you want to be going out and doing things that are going to keep your immune system up. So for example, exercising regularly, that's going to improve your immune system. So, go out and walk, while you can, go out and walk in your neighborhood. If you want to meet up with a friend and you can socially distance and you want to go on a walk, do that. If you want to go on a hike somewhere, go on a hike. If there's things that you can do to exercise in your house, exercise is something that really can boost your immune system. And then things like eating healthier eating is also going to boost your immune system. Talking to your doctor about, is there vitamins or supplements I can take, at my age that are, is there, for example, if you're not going outside, vitamin D deficiency is something that really could affect you with COVID. So are you somebody that needs to be taking vitamin D every day to make sure that you're staying as healthy as you can? So, locking yourself in your house while, that's going to keep you away from other people. If you're not, maintaining a certain level of fitness and, maintaining your mental health as well. A lot of being sick is being in a mental place to fight it off. And if you're isolating yourself in your house and, you're not going out and doing anything, that really can have a negative effect on your mental health. So you really should be doing as much as you can, as smartly as you can.
I have another question to you about your thoughts on the drug. And I, honestly, I've never been able to pronounce it, so I probably won't be able to pronounce it now, but the hydroxychloroquine, did I pronounce it right? No.
Yeah, no, you nailed it.
So what are your thoughts about that? And, supposedly it's worked in other countries. And this viewer is asking, did your research find this to be true or false? And, and why aren't people using it here? So.
Yeah. So the problem with a lot of the hydroxychloroquine studies is that the individuals that were in the study were either relatively healthy, so you expected them to have a better outcome regardless of the drug or not. And then some of the populations were like the sickest. So, for example, one of the studies that came out of Brazil was like the sickest of the sick people, and virtually all of them died. So did they die because they were going to die anyway, or did they die because of hydroxychloroquine? So, my issue with a lot of those studies is that unfortunately, in the situation that we're in, we're kind of throwing the kitchen sink at COVID to try and save anybody who's deathly ill. And a lot of the problem is that, there in some of these studies it's shown that if you give hydroxychloroquine with steroids, that's bad. If you give hydroxychloroquine with this, maybe it works. So part of the problem is that we're not testing hydroxychloroquine by itself. We're giving a bunch of other things because we're throwing the kitchen sink at this. So in terms of hydroxychloroquine, I wouldn't put a label on it as good or bad. I would put a label on it that the studies and the available information we have don't suggest that it's the miracle answer, but there is data. And again, some of the populations were very, very sick. So we don't know if they died because of giving hydroxychloroquine or they died because they were going to die regardless. But there's some concerning data about hydroxychloroquine out there. So I wouldn't label it as good or bad, but I don't know that if it was one of my parents, I would authorize its use.
Okay. Here's another question. What country do you think absolutely nailed it? Do you think there's another country that did a great job? And if so, what were they doing? We've seen so much criticism in the United States about how, our country wasn't armed well enough or, hasn't taken it on well enough. In your opinion, is there any other country that did it better?
I mean, I think pretty much I think saying that any country won is just not true. This pandemic affected everyone everywhere. I think there were countries that, in the beginning, there were very, very small countries that, because of very, very small populations, were able to ramp up enough testing to be successful for a little while. For example, in Singapore, in the beginning, they had things like mandatory testing. When a contact tracer called you, they would make you go to a specific predetermined part of your house and actually FaceTime you so that they could see that you were in your house. And they could call you at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Like they could call you at any time to make sure that you were at your house. However, once a few people slipped through the cracks, they also had an outbreak. But there's also like laws in Singapore that you can't chew gum. They also have a lot more regulation, over the people that live in Singapore than we have, in Western Europe and here. So I don't really think there was any country that I can say, won against COVID, because, unfortunately every country had deaths. Every country had infections. Even the countries, there were a few countries that didn't shut down. They didn't fare any better than the rest of us did. So I think there might be, small areas where maybe there was a little bit more community buy-in to lockdowns and things like that. But, I think in terms of overall response, I think COVID caught, the world by surprise. I don't really think any of us had the laboratory capability that we would have liked when this started. Because again, when you're not in a pandemic, this type of laboratory capacity is never necessary. We would never need this type of lab capacity ever at any other time. But it's definitely a consideration moving forward to have laboratory capacity plans to ramp up in a pandemic, to try and respond. But because, I think it's just a matter of when, not if. We know that there's going to be another pandemic of something at some time. And if it warrants testing, then, we need to take the lessons that we learned from COVID-19 and maybe have those plans in place to ramp up testing more quickly. And then, one of the biggest issues with testing was supply limitation. Because again, once we built the capacity, you can only get the supplies so quickly. So,
Right.
how can we ramp up, PPE? So we need a ton of PPE. You got to ramp up PPE. You got to ramp up the testing supplies, and then you've got to disseminate those. So I think moving forward, one of the biggest things we can do is look at emergency planning and look at plans for how can we, distribute, how can we manufacture and distribute all these things. And those would be the considerations moving forward. But in terms of a country who won against coronavirus, I don't think you're going to find one.
Well, yeah, I agree. And there's just, like you say, just a lot of variables. But we are at the end of our hour, but I have so many other questions. Do you mind staying for a few more minutes to answer?
Absolutely.
I'll just ask a couple more. Let me just choose here. I have so many coming in. Have you ever seen, this is one question, have you ever seen a virus like COVID so politicized? How does this affect your ability to do your job on a purely scientific basis?
So, I think one of the reasons that this could be so politicized is this, this is really the first pandemic we've had where, social media is at our fingertips. People can write a news story on their phone and get things out so much quicker, than we ever could before. So, I think with as quickly as information can get out, that's how quickly misinformation can get out as well. In my career and in my experience, I've never seen something like this so politicized. And, I think, for me, it's very disheartening because I don't think, people losing jobs, that's not political. People losing family members, that's not political. This is a human situation that we're all in, and we need to be focusing on how can we save lives, how can we get kids back in school, how can we get people back to work. Those need to be the focuses, not one politician coming out looking better than somebody else, because I don't really think most of them don't look any better than the other ones. So I think that the politicization of this has, made it very difficult at a local level because, it's kind of breeded mistrust, and you never know who that mistrust is going to, sometimes people associate the health department with politicians. So they don't want to talk to our case investigators and say who they've been around or say who their close contacts are. Maybe they don't want to give us information at all. So with this being very politicized, it's made it very difficult at the local level to gain people's trust. And, that's something that we've been working on. We've been trying to, promote that, we're trustworthy and you can give us information. But I think the politicization of this has made it very difficult for people to trust really anybody, whether it's their physician, their neighbor, their
Right.
health department. It's made
Right.
it very difficult to trust anybody.
Well, and I think, Kaylee, you and I talked a little before the show, and we were talking about how it's framed as well. And anything can be framed, even the same number or the same percentages can be framed in a positive light or in a negative light. It just depends on, the setup. Or like we were talking about earlier, in a movie, you have the suspenseful music or the comedic relief music. So, can you just, if you have the numbers, at the top of your mind of the percentage of the population, if you know them, both statewide as well as, nationwide, and in terms of the death rate and the infectious rate, those infected?
So again, those are not really numbers that I like to provide. Again, just because we don't have a good grasp on what the actual denominator of those numbers is.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think that, and again, this is something that I would direct people to the OakGov website to look at our dashboard, because we do report how many deaths have been reported each day. So, people get really fixated on the death rate, and what is the death rate. But, if you look at our dashboard, the reality is that regardless of what the death rate is, every death that's listed on our website, that's a mother, that's a brother, that's a sister, that's a daughter, that's someone to somebody. And regardless of
Sure.
what that death rate is, that was a person that was important to people. So, rather than fixating on what the death rate is or what the survival rate is, we still need to understand that, when we're reporting, how many ever deaths we're reporting for that day, regardless of maybe what that death rate was, that was a person to somebody. And I think the way that people talk about the death rate is, it really upsets people who have lost loved ones to COVID-19 because, even, people who've lost 90-year-old grandparents, nobody's ever ready to lose a family member. And, this idea that just because people are older, and they were in a nursing home, that's, still not acceptable. We don't want people dying of things that we could potentially prevent. So,
No, absolutely. I
the death
agree.
rate
I
may
just
be
was hoping to
low
give.
relatively, but
Mhm.
again, we until we can get a very, very good grasp on what that denominator is, we've got to be careful with giving death rates.
Okay. I was just hoping to give some people some hope that, it's not all doom and gloom out there. We're
Well,
being safe, we're being cautious,
the number of
and
deaths is going down. If you
Mhm.
look at our dashboard, and you go back into
Mhm.
March and April, I mean, there were some days where we were in the 20s or 30s for deaths, and right now we're barely reporting a half a death a day.
Okay.
So the number of deaths relative to the number of cases we're reporting is definitely decreasing. It's certainly decreasing from what it was in March and April, but again, we don't know that that's because the virus is less deadly. It might be because our average age has shifted and the severity of illness is not as bad in younger people.
Well, I'd like to talk, the last question is really about contact tracing and classroom tracing. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that now that, the kids are back in school or virtually. And I know there's some private schools that are going, physically back to school, still wearing masks and all that. If you can talk a little bit about the classroom contacting or, I'm sorry, the um, contract tracing and whether it's in the classroom or in our communities. I think people are a little confused about what it means. Do we all have to have an app on our phone? Are we not going to be allowed somewhere if we don't have this? What can you talk to us about all of that?
Sure. So, specifically in the schools, when we're contact tracing a case in the school, first of all, we do everything that we can to protect the privacy of the individual who tested positive because that is very important. But we do work with the school. We work with whether it's the principal, the teacher in the classroom, if there's multiple different teachers in multiple classrooms. We really do work with all of those individuals to try and figure out, who needs to be quarantined and who doesn't. Because again, at the end of the day, we do want kids in school. So we don't want to just be quarantining a whole classroom if we don't need to. So a lot of, one of the things we've been asking the schools is, if you're in session, please have a seating chart in your classroom and, do not move the students from those seats because if you have a seating chart, we can very quickly, very easily figure out, okay, in this classroom, these people were not at risk. We need to do a little bit more digging about the people who are sitting around this person. And then we can move on to the next period. Okay, these people we're not worried about, these ones we might be. So when we're looking at schools, we really are evaluating every single case on a case by case basis. There can be situations where we would recommend quarantine to an entire classroom, but we really are trying to do it on a basis of we're only quarantining the individuals who need to be quarantined. So we do an extensive investigation with the schools to figure out, are there students or staff that need to be quarantined? We ask the case, did you eat lunch with anybody at lunch today? And if, they ate lunch with people, obviously when you're eating, your mask is off. So those would be considered people exposed. So, we do extensive investigations in schools. And then in terms of outside of schools, we will contact a case. So, for example, say that you had coronavirus, I would call you and I would say, what day did you become sick? And if you said, oh, I became sick today, I would ask you for the last 2 days, who have you been around? So you might tell
Mhm.
me, oh, I've been around my spouse and my children. So we would quarantine them. And then you might say, well, I was with my mom 4 days ago. So your mom doesn't get quarantined. But you might say, oh, you know what? My neighbor came over for a little while and we talked. And yeah, we talked for more than 15 minutes. We were closer than 6 feet. Then, we would quarantine your neighbor. But then you might say, my other neighbor just walked past me. So we wouldn't need to quarantine them. So we really do evaluate every case on a case-by-case basis to identify who those contacts are.
And then would it be your responsibility to call those people, or is it the person infected having to call those people?
So there's some people want it handled different. Some people want to, if it's a friend of theirs, they'll say, can I just give them a call real quick before you call them? But ultimately, any contacts that are given to us, the health department contacts them, says that you've been a contact to a case, and we don't tell them what your name is. Most of the time, they already know who they've been exposed to. Because again, a lot of our cases are, hey, this is a friend of mine. Do you mind if I just call them and tell them real quick? Sometimes we're on the phone with them and they're already texting their friends being like, hey, you're going to get quarantined. Sorry. A lot of it is not a surprise. Sometimes it is a surprise, but again, we don't share any personal information. We just say that you've been exposed to a case of coronavirus, and then we recommend that they stay home 14 days from their last exposure. Now, quarantining from your last exposure, this is where personal responsibility comes in with coronavirus. We don't put an app on your phone. We don't track you. We don't trace you in any way with GPS. So it really is on the honor system that you're staying home and you're maintaining that quarantine. But again, that's where the personal responsibility comes in with this, because again, there are people who refuse to do interviews with us altogether, and we never know who their contacts are because they refuse to speak with us. So obviously those contacts are still out and about because we don't know who they are. And then, if people choose not to stay home, or they stay home for the most part, but they decide, oh, my kid has a baseball game today and I want to go, and they go to that baseball game, they would have broken quarantine. So, we don't monitor people with a GPS, but we really do strongly recommend and explain to people why it's beneficial for them to complete the quarantine.
And do you have issues trying to get people to, work with you with all the HIPAA rules and regulations out there, or are you, trying to work in compliance with all of that as well?
So, we definitely, as the health department, one of the things that we place a lot of importance on is, making sure that we're maintaining privacy. And we only give information to people who need it. So if we don't need to give someone's name, we don't give them the name. We don't give them specifics about their situation, or, if an employer calls us to verify, hey, my employee says that they were exposed to a case of coronavirus, I want to know by who, when, and where. We're like, we can't tell you that, but we can confirm that we have recommended that they quarantine. So we do maintain HIPAA to the highest level.
Yeah, I just wanted our viewers to understand that as well, that you are bound by those rules and regulations, just like every other person, that you're not, beyond the law in that respect. So,
Absolutely.
Well, Kayleigh, I'm so grateful for all of your time. You've been a wealth of knowledge. And I've always said, with knowledge comes power and empowerment, and people feeling more like they're in control of their lives and their destinies a little bit more, and all this uncertainty and this uniqueness, this unique time that we're in. It's just nice to be able to give some of our viewers some relief. And, with that, can you give just a few, just a last minute, discussion, or some words of advice or wisdom that there will be light at the end of the tunnel, that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that this too shall pass, and, that we'll be better for it as a nation.
Absolutely. As an epidemiologist, I believe in numbers, I believe in science, and I believe in what we're doing. But I also believe in people. And I really do believe everything that I've seen, that we've been through in terms of infectious diseases, in terms of responses in this county. The people within this community, and, I'm not from Southeastern Michigan. I'm kind of a transplant here, but we really do come together as a community, and we really do respond to these things. So, I think the more that we push forward, the more we continue with contact tracing, the more we try and, reopen and implement things piece by piece by piece, the more people are willing to work with each other, and the more, you're willing to wear a mask to protect, your neighbor's willing to wear a mask to protect you. The more that we can do that, we really just, need to keep our fingers crossed that, a late Christmas present of a vaccine will arrive, and, we can start to figure out how we're going to roll that out, and hopefully we'll keep moving forward. And the only other thing I can say is that if you're having anxiety about anything about COVID-19, if you're looking for resources, if you just have questions, Oakland County has a great service called Nurse on Call. You can call between 8:30 and 6 p.m. every day, and you can talk to a registered nurse who can answer your questions or help you find whatever resource that it is that you're looking for. That can be found on our website, but the phone number for that is 800-848-5533.
Kaylee, thank you so much. Again, I'm just so grateful for all the time and information that you've given. And I wish you and your team all the best, and continue doing the great work. You're just doing an amazing job. I can imagine how busy you all are and working, all these endless hours. And I'm very, very grateful. And I know so many of us are so grateful for all your service. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.
So everybody, you heard it right from the horse's mouth. Just an amazing woman who is so knowledgeable and so informed and so intelligent about just all aspects of COVID-19. And I hope you were able to glean some information, some knowledge, and some advice on knowing how to, navigate these uncharted waters, and to live and to continue to live and not be stymied by fear or anxiety. Get out there, try to live your life, be cautious, but don't let fear get in the way of, trying to live, because this is our new normal for a while. And while they're working steadfast on a vaccine or some sort of prophylactic medicine, please try to do your best at living a normal life. Mental health is a very important aspect of that. Stay strong. You heard what Kaylee said. Keep working out, or start working out, go for walks, do everything you can to maintain your physical health and your mental health. And all of this will fall into place. And again, we will be a better nation as a result, because we will be stronger and more unified and better when we act together. So thank you so much for joining me here today on my Cronin Challenge2Change program. Please like our YouTube channel page and subscribe to it. We will be uploading content regularly. Please continue to like our Facebook page and join us on Instagram. And we will be continuing to provide you invaluable content and more information to arm yourself with knowledge, because with knowledge comes power. And when you feel empowered, you can feel better about your life and the lives of all of those around you. So have a wonderful day. Go out there, get some exercise, stay strong, keep your spirits high, and join us next time. Take care, everybody.